Hello everyone, Clown Decade, etc, etc. After a month of clown decading, we finally get back to having a bit of a go at Tom Nicholas for knowing absolutely nothing about how economics works. If you haven't watched part 1 and 2 of this video, the links are down below, please give them a watch first. Otherwise, it's been a month. Quick recap. He started off his economic analysis from 2010, kind of just ignoring the fact that there was a financial crash. He then uses 2010 as his baseline, obviously, which is even stupider because year on year, the economy's grown since 2010. And then started to try to blame Brexit and brought absolutely no economic analysis into Brexit. That was basically just an excuse to say, I don't particularly like the Tories bad. Anyway, now he's on to COVID. Let's get into it.
On the 30th of January 2020, the first 2 cases of COVID-19 are documented in Britain. Then, on the 23rd of March, Boris Johnson appears on national TV to announce a nationwide lockdown.
Yeah, and pretty much everyone now in hindsight says that was pretty much pointless. I talk to my dad about it sometimes, and he literally thought that millions of people were going to die. He thought it'd be like the Black Plague. And so obviously they supported lockdown at the time, especially because they're, pushing the pensioner age. My mum and my dad, But in hindsight, they kind of agree with my perspective, which is, if you care so much about living through it, fine, isolate, that's fine, you don't need to go out. Let people like me, who are quite low risk of it, go out though. And, okay, I lived with my parents at the time. If they really wanted to, we could have a quarantine thing going. Especially with how big their house was. I was living with my parents at the time. Obviously not everyone has that luxury, but hopefully Tom will get into it. Yeah, this did quite a nasty number on the economy. Because believe it or not, paying people with the furlough scheme to do absolutely nothing is not a good way to grow an economy. It's a good way to, say, stop people dying, but it gets them into pretty bad habits. And we've had an employment crisis ever since. This is why post-Brexit, more migrants have been getting jobs than British natives, because our government effectively encouraged us to not work.
Johnson had initially been pretty sceptical about invoking such a measure. Ever the Conservative, he was worried about the impact that shutting everyone in their houses might have on business.
Yeah, it was very sensible, and Sweden ended up not doing a lockdown, ended up not having 1 million deaths, and ended up with a pretty stable economy throughout. Again, to be fair, this is hindsight. And again, we're not the same as Sweden because we're much more densely populated. But regardless, worst case scenario, kind of as far as I'd go with lockdown, maximum we should have done is 2 weeks and get test and trace out, which we did a pretty good job of getting test and trace out. But frankly, our civil service is an absolute joke, and so they wanted it pretty much forever. Probably because it gave them an excuse to work from home and do nothing. Source: I know people in the civil service.
He briefly considered actively allowing the disease to spread across the country to build so-called herd immunity through infection.
Yeah, that was a view that was actually put to him by virologists. That was actually a common view at the time. This has been completely rolled over, by the way. During the COVID inquiry, Dominic Cummings talks about this all the time, but during the COVID inquiry, it's been such an embarrassment. They get lead scientists in, and the lead scientists basically just say, yeah, I was never for herd immunity, despite the fact that they were for herd immunity at the time. And there's absolutely no pushback on it. It's just, right, okay, thank you for your statement. This then inevitably leads Tom to say, oh, it was just crazy Johnson's idea. No, Johnson was working off advice. But the advice changed thanks to the WHO. And this is why people want to leave the WHO. 1, because it's run by Marxists. 2, because it's shut down the country for no reason, based off their advice.
Nevertheless, with deaths rising exponentially, doing nothing eventually becomes untenable.
I really have come to hate this video, because all Tom is trying to do here is quickly show you, oh look, a graph, oh look, exponentially rising deaths. Look at the graph. The graph makes no sense. It starts at 0, goes to 3, goes to 2, and then goes to 4. What the hell is this graph? And again, if you look at it again, confirmed COVID deaths, that's all people are going to see with how quickly it was on the screen, per million people. 4 deaths per million people. I don't even think this graph is accurate. Well, it can't be accurate. The scale's all screwed up. I'm surprised he got January, February, March in the right order. I don't know why he didn't just use this graph or trace over it. Yeah, deaths did go right up in March. That's why there was a bit of a panic. But even then, you can't necessarily trust these numbers because it's quite an open secret that doctors were putting down that people died of COVID just to fast track a death. You know, oh, I want to get them out of here quickly. People counted as dying of COVID when they die of other complications, but they happened to have COVID at the time. These are things we know that were happening. And thankfully now, because it was 4 years ago, we can actually get away with saying it. And wouldn't you know it, when you look at the graph overall, all the way up to May 2023, the people saying, oh, this will just be a flu. Well, it turns out when we actually treat it properly, yeah, it looks like that was right. I mean, I have no doubt that there will have been a spike in 2020, or the 2 spikes that we see, but these are definitely over-exaggerated because of basically all the incentives given to the people in charge of all this COVID stuff to say people were dying of COVID when they weren't necessarily. They just died when they had it. But anyway, even if he didn't say that and actually put up a decent graph like this, I wouldn't have to stop the video here to call him an idiot again.
With everyone stuck inside, glued to the TV, it's perhaps only right that politics becomes a bit of a soap opera over the next few months.
Well, I don't just think it's to do with the fact that they don't have much else to do. I also think it's to do with the fact that the reason they don't have much else to do is because of politics. And it was really annoying because I'd obviously started this channel in 2018 and was basically 2 years ahead of pretty much everyone else. I'd say that I was a rung above amateur when it came to political commentary. And my god, it involved a lot of explaining to people my age of how politics actually works.
First, Johnson himself contracts COVID, and swiftly goes from being entirely unconcerned by the disease to lying in an intensive care unit in St Thomas Hospital. Then, this guy, Johnson's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, gets caught out for having broken lockdown rules by visiting his wife 5 hours away whilst displaying COVID symptoms.
I mean, let's be fair here, that's because his, 4-year-old child was also getting very sick. I don't think it was related to COVID. And again, visiting his wife, no, it was so that his parents, or her parents, I can't remember which one, would be able to, care for the child while the other two were... He wasn't violently ill, she was. His wife was violently ill. Cummings was displaying symptoms, I believe, but didn't have a positive COVID test, and the specifics of it are that he drove to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight before he tried to drive back to London to, run the country again. Now, I even remember at the time, pretty much everyone I know was pretty... And I'm even talking lefties. When they heard that it was because his child was very sick and he basically couldn't look after the child and run the country and have COVID, people understood, oh yeah, no, this all makes sense. And if you're in charge of it, fair enough. And then he was investigated. I think the police ended up saying, yes, it was a minor infraction, but we're going to drop the charges. So it's one of those things of, he broke the rules, but everyone broke the rules, and if anything, he broke the rules less than your average person. So yeah, it ended up that the only people that cared are people that hate Cummings because he got Brexit done.
Amid these controversies, Johnson's allies in the Conservative Party find numerous ways to use the pandemic to funnel money into the wallets of their friends.
What, is this going to be your argument? The reason that our economy sucks is because money went into PPE? Is that where we're going here? I think it was something like 70 million. In fact, I'm going to check. So, and to make it clear, I'm not defending any of this. But the numbers I'm seeing, at least from Wikipedia, are contracts for 122 million, and then a second one for 80 million, and then I think that ended up with about, 30 million in profit, something like that. As much as everyone involved should be punished for this, Britain is not poor because of this PPE controversy. We are not £200 million poorer, and therefore loads of people in poverty. Relative poverty, I should add. And as far as I'm aware, this company actually provided PPE. The problem was that Michelle Mone was lobbying for a specific company that she had special interests in to be the one to provide it and to be fast-tracked due to, COVID being urgent. Effectively, she played the system, but she actually delivered what was paid for, as far as I'm aware. So again, as much as she deserves to be punished, it's not like this money was just thrown at her into a black hole where we had nothing to show for it. Again, to be clear, I'm not defending the actions here. I am saying that if the 200 million actually got us something in return, it wasn't a waste of money. The scandal wasn't the fact that the money was wasted, it's the fact that the money was used quite usefully, but lobbied for a specific company that someone in government had a special interest in and played the system to benefit from.
It quickly becomes apparent that the country's National Health Service is going to need a whole load of additional masks, aprons, and other protective gear.
Yeah, boom, there we go. This is all so predictable. These things are bad, but this is not to do with economic analysis. Why is the country poor? Or because 0.01% of our GDP was spent on PPE companies that were lobbied by the government? Yeah, I don't think so, my dude.
Johnson & Co. thus leveraged this urgency to suspend anti-corruption laws around government outsourcing. Billions of pounds worth of public money is handed over to the friends and acquaintances of government ministers, in some cases in return for equipment which is entirely unusable.
I just absolutely hate Tom at this point. Billions apparently was wasted on PPE. Billions! And yet every headline here, 21 million, 200 million. Not even a number for that BBC News article, but you know what? I'm going to search it up and see what numbers it comes up with. I just checked it, and there's absolutely no numbers in there about money whatsoever, but did come up with numbers for face masks and things like that. The numbers were like 50 to 70 million pieces of PPE couldn't be used because of ear loops instead of head loops, so they don't fit tightly enough, things like that. It wasn't that they definitely couldn't be used, it was they'd all need to be tested before use. So, you know, those numbers, again, are a bit sketchy. And either way, once again, in hindsight, the PPE thing hasn't really been an issue. It's just the government lobbying thing that's been a problem. And I don't know why you have to lie about it. Why'd you have to say billions? This wasn't billions, this was 200 million. Again, should be investigated and punished for it, sure. Not the reason we're poor. And again, we're not even poor.
Whether through illegitimate means or not, protecting the interests of business remains at the top of the government's agenda throughout the pandemic.
I mean, frankly, that's just a laughable claim. I still remember making videos on, especially small businesses, basically begging for the government to open up the country again, so that they could, you know, make money, because furlough wasn't pushing them far enough. But of course, that's the thing, isn't it? It's probably true of big businesses. Big businesses could afford all this, especially Amazon, who were allowed to continue to operate, but other online delivery businesses weren't allowed to. But of course, that's the problem with left-wingers, isn't it? All they think of when they think of business is Amazon and massive companies, massive multinational corporations like that, when in reality, the vast majority of the numbers that make up businesses are small or medium enterprises in Britain, ones that have been pushed down by big business, most of which were absolutely squashed by COVID. I mean, you know, tech companies that can work remotely, they mostly did okay, but as I say, there was a reason that like barbershops and things like that started putting up images of the Magna Carta on their windows to say, you know, I have a right to actually work, no matter how relevant the clauses were, because, well, people wanted to keep running their business, but the government wouldn't let them.
Efforts to keep things ticking over financially are led by this guy, Rishi Sunak. When the first national lockdown ends in summer 2020, all sense of caution is thrown out of the window in favour of getting things back to normal as soon as possible.
Oh my god, it's Mauler's Law. It's Mauler's Law. You put a visual up on the screen from a video essayist that says the exact opposite of what you're just saying. No, all caution is not thrown out the window. Quite clearly there are still restrictions still in place. As there were. You were only allowed to have, 6 people in a group, something like that? I believe that was the time as well where you were only allowed to go to the pub if you were going to have a substantial meal. Bar staff absolutely hated enforcing this stuff because everyone at this point pretty much knew it was nonsense. But well, I suppose this is what constitutes as pro-business and throwing all restrictions out the window. Keeping restrictions in that absolutely everyone hates and does absolutely no good for business.
In August, Sunak launches a scheme called Eat Out to Help Out.
What, and is this why we're poor? What's your analysis here?
This sees the government subsidising meals bought in restaurants to encourage people to get out of their houses and support the hospitality sector.
Yeah, I mean, from a government's perspective, it probably makes sense. Oh, this will help people get back to a sense of normalcy, and it'll encourage them as well to get money circulating again, because, yeah, the economy took quite a hit from being locked down. Took a hell of a hit. Everyone could recognise it.
And people go for it, gobbling up 160 million state-subsidised meals between them. This might be good for Nando's and Pizza Express, but it's less good for anyone who wants the pandemic to be over.
I mean, I'm not being funny, but I don't know anyone who was in the hospitality business who was necessarily upset with Eat Out to Help Out. It's like Tom Nicholas doesn't know that there's more restaurants out there than just Nando's. Like, there's absolutely loads of restaurants and cafes that benefited from Eat Out to Help Out that are, just run by one person.
Sunak's scheme contributes to a near doubling of cases during that month. And very quickly, all the progress made throughout the first lockdown appears to be in vain.
Oh my god, I mean, listen, I was not a fan of lockdowns, so I am giving pretty much all my perspective from a government that is somewhat pro-lockdown. And I'm not being funny, but Tom's perspective is, quite clearly, we basically should never have come out of lockdown. That's effectively what he's implying here. But again, even from this graph, Eat Out to Help Out, that was implemented in August. You didn't see a spike till like October, as you can see, late September, when, flu season starts coming about. What was COVID-19? An influenza virus. So blaming this on Eat Out to Help Out is moronic. As soon as the lockdown was lifted off, even without the subsidised meals, people still would have gone out. You still probably would have seen this spike. It might have been down a bit, sure, but it still would have been there. Again, this has just gone off. This isn't about economics. This whole video has not been about economics. This isn't about how Britain is quote-unquote poor. This whole video is about, I absolutely hate the Tories. There's a reason he chose 2010 instead of, 2007 as his starting point. It's because if he started there, he'd have to talk about Labour and how their handling of the financial crash wasn't the greatest reaction ever. Selling off most of our gold? Yeah, good one, Gordon Brown. Then again, he probably praised that because this guy's an idiot.
As cases begin to rise exponentially once more.
Yep, indeed. The study that I found through Wikipedia does indicate that indeed a scheme that lasted from Monday to Wednesday found that COVID-19 would spread more on days where people used Eat Out to Help Out and there was low rainfall. But again, if I just get the graph that Tom used up on the screen again, given that this ended at the end of August and the exponential spike came up in September, October, it's pretty stupid to blame this entirely on Eat Out to Help Out. In fact, it's stupid to blame Eat Out to Help Out at all for the second lockdown. Second lockdown was inevitable because flu season.
Boris Johnson spends the rest of the year trying and failing to avoid implementing further lockdowns.
Yeah, there's a pretty blatant reason why. It's because the lockdowns were making Britain poorer, which is supposed to be the whole point of this. Why is Britain poor? Answer: lockdowns. Was it worth it to save millions of lives? No, we're at a point where even that's questionable.
At one point, he tells colleagues that he would rather let the bodies pile high than confine people to their homes again.
Yeah, the reason he said this was because long term, the bodies will have piled high as well due to the economic downturn another mass long-term lockdown would have caused. Which is actually why they tried to bring in the tier system. It was to try and make sure that at least some parts of the country could stay in business. Because, again, you just look at this GDP graph. Clearly, it causes a massive downturn in terms of the economy. That's what he was worried about. So, yeah, take a hit now, don't have one later. We are now later. And Labour are now trying to say that this is the worst economy that they've ever inherited. It's not true, by the way. It's actually all right for what it is. And to be fair to Tom Nicholas here, he made this video before the election, so he can't even try and use that lie to make his point even further in this video. But it is quite funny that efforts to try and not make Britain poor are being seen as evil by Tom Nicholas in a video that is trying to say Britain is poor because Tories are bad.
Nevertheless, the rise in cases eventually becomes too significant to ignore, and the UK is subjected to 2 more national lockdowns during 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, you can thank the civil service for that, and once again, as Dominic Cummings says in pretty much every interview since, the COVID inquiry that's supposed to try and work out, okay, what were the problems with lockdown, how could it be better, is basically just a misinformation machine. It's just taking every scientist in the civil service at their word and basically trying to put all the blame on the idiots in the cabinet, which they were idiots, but to only blame them is moronic, because they were mostly following the advice from scientists.
The Conservative Party's lead in the polls, which had peaked at 22% whilst Johnson was in hospital, takes a bit of a tumble during these chaotic months of last-minute lockdowns. But by the spring, a successful COVID vaccine rollout puts Johnson on the up again.
Yep, the vaccine rollout was one of the best in Europe. The task force that Cummings put together to get the vaccine rolled out and for everyone to be inoculated as much as they can to COVID-19 is generally seen as a very good thing by pretty much everyone. And then what did the civil service do with this task force? That effectively turned into, how can we react better to future pandemic cases? Oh, they got rid of it because it was too good. Genuinely, this happened. And people like Tom Nicholas are falling right into this trap of, yeah, it was pretty good, but if he found out that something Dominic Cummings made was got rid of in the civil service, he'd probably say that was a good thing too. Because this is the type of man who would say, oh, we need to develop better critical thinking skills, and then has absolutely none of his own.
In May, the Conservatives win a historic by-election victory in Hartlepool, and things look stronger still. Sure, there might be a lack of lorry drivers and a shortage of basic foods in the supermarket as a result of Johnson's Brexit deal.
Oh my god, I completely forgot about that non-issue. What, like 10 supermarkets in London didn't have sandwiches for a day and all of a sudden everyone's dying of malnutrition? No, no one died of malnutrition. The food supply was absolutely fine. But to just blame it on the Brexit deal is absolute nonsense. In the UK, there are around 350,000 trucks in operation, and since AI has not yet mastered driverless HGVs like in The Simpsons, there's an ongoing demand for human truck drivers to operate these colossal vehicles. The proliferation of e-commerce and home delivery services has led to a surge in the number of trucks on the road, consequently increasing the demand for drivers. Again, a result of COVID. Everyone started using Amazon. The shortage of HGV drivers has been a long-standing issue, and at times it has reached critical level. The main factors contributing to it were the fact that the DVSA, the government body that handles handing out driving licences, was unable to conduct approximately 50,000 HGV driving tests, which would make up drivers for a seventh of the vehicle. So that's going to cause quite a supply issue of drivers. Many HGV drivers also decided to retire early during this time, further depleting the pool of experienced drivers. And again, this is another issue. Loads of people retired early for COVID because they were paid not to work and thought, why would I go back to work then? In addition, the UK's decision to leave the EU resulted in a decline in the number of EU HGV drivers willing to come to the UK for commercial driving jobs. Many EU HGV drivers who are already residing in the UK opted to return to the continent to live and work, exacerbating the shortage of experienced drivers on UK roads. So yeah, Brexit, part of the problem, sure, but it is fundamentally and completely dishonest, as Tom Nicholas has said here, to blame it pretty much entirely or even primarily on Brexit. Brexit was a secondary problem. A lot of these people will have returned home because of COVID too, because they probably want to be with their families in a time of lockdown. So again, just blaming Brexit? Moronic. And that's not even bringing up the I-35 issues, which effectively give pointless extra regulation to people who are self-employed. So self-employed haulers just didn't bother working because it was too annoying. And so yeah, ended up working as a delivery driver for Tesco or something like that, because the money's not bad.
Behind the scenes, he reportedly talks of wanting to remain in power for a decade.
And I'm not being funny, he probably could have done it if after COVID he stopped listening to his wife and started listening to Cummings again, but unfortunately Cummings got kicked out due to the whole Barnard Castle thing. Which is a damn shame, because I think Dominic Cummings would do pretty well as a special advisor to the Prime Minister if he were to ever do that again with, say, I don't know, obviously this is somewhat of a pipe dream, but someone like Nigel Farage or his successor.
Then it all comes crashing down.
In November 2022, the Daily Mirror publishes an article revealing that Boris Johnson and his staff had hosted several staff parties in 10 Downing Street the previous Christmas.
What's this got to do with the economy? Like, seriously, where's the economic analysis here? Again, this was a video that was advertised as Why Britain's Poor, and it very quickly, barely halfway through part one, just turned into I hate the Tories and here's why. This isn't good economic analysis. I'm kind of glad I went through this video, because this feels very much like a long version of a Guardian article. where you get a headline and then there's about 10 different grievances that they have within the text that have nothing to do with the title. This is exactly what's happening here.
This flew directly in the face of rules banning social gatherings, rules which had been drawn up in that very same building.
Yes, with advisors there who were there to say whether what they were doing was lawful or not, and they said it was lawful. My God. If it's not clear to everyone, I am completely on the side but that Boris Johnson was completely stitched up. And this is someone who didn't particularly like Boris Johnson at the time he was getting stitched up because of his clear move to left-wing causes, such as, you know, the net zero thing, banning cars, being slow with lockdown. I know that Tom's trying to say that Boris wasn't pro-lockdown. Boris did end up being pro-lockdown because he nearly died. But it was probably Rishi Sunak giving him numbers saying, look, GDP's really bad, we need line to go up.
The Prime Minister's office initially denies these reports, but footage and photos soon begin to emerge.
Again, just to labour the point of how ridiculous this whole situation was, literally everyone in this picture was working together all day in the same building. And this is why the special advisors and the people there thought they weren't doing anything wrong. So it's, oh, we've been here all day, let's have some birthday cake and a quick drink. This is nothing compared to the other parties we saw throughout. I can't even remember if they were on Downing Street. I think some of them were, that Johnson wasn't even at. This is the only thing Johnson was found at, and he was found to be the worst Prime Minister ever because of it. Again, this is how ridiculous it is. Working with each other all day, let's have some quick cake and drinks to celebrate a birthday for like an hour, and then we'll go home. And everyone said, yeah, of course you're not breaking lockdown rules. You've been working together all day. It'd be ridiculous to say that. But then obviously, because all the lockdown rules were rushed through Parliament and there wasn't too much actual scrutiny on the whole thing, obviously mistakes were going to be made. I mean, I'm not being funny. If this was breaking lockdown rules, everyone in Britain broke lockdown rules. And everyone should be fined.
All in all, 17 parties are found to have taken place among staff, and both Johnson and Rishi Sunak are eventually fined for breaking the law.
Again, I don't really care about Sunak, but Boris Johnson was only found at this party. That's all he was done for. And this is why a lot of people saw it as a stitch-up. Because absolutely everyone agreed that they too had broken the lockdown rules in a similar way. I say everyone, I obviously mean everyone who isn't part of the new elite bubble, which Tom is just part of. He just happens to be on the alternative media side of it.
Johnson's political career had rarely been without scandal, but the clear hypocrisy of the PM setting rules whilst ignoring them himself helps this one to stick.
Yeah, and as I say, it was absolutely ridiculous. I'd say it was more of a problem of the COVID rules not being well thought out more than he actually did anything morally wrong. Because, again, what the actual scandal was, it wasn't necessarily that he was being a hypocrite here. The problem was that he lied to Parliament. And again, I no doubt he's going to go into that, but even that's nonsense. Between the final report, the interim report, and the draft report, they were changing the definition of what he actually did wrong. At first it was that he deliberately lied to Parliament. They found that he didn't deliberately lie, so they changed it to recklessly lied. These are just obvious stitch-ups, but Tom doesn't care about any of this, because all Tom's video here is just to say is, I hate the Tories and you should too. So he's never going to be fair about this.
Then, a few weeks later, Johnson attempts to promote an MP who's been credibly accused of multiple accounts of sexual assault.
I do love the term credibly accused. The implication there is that he's trying to say he's guilty before he's actually gone to trial or court. That's the point of that wording there. And I genuinely really hate this whole idea of if someone's been accused of something and they're going to court over it, that means that they need to lose their job. The whole point of court is that they are presumed innocent. It's like with Hugh Edwards and people demanding that he give his salary back, and the BBC didn't fire him straight away. That part of it I don't really care about. Just because he's been accused does not mean that you need to fire him and stop him being paid. It's quite a ridiculous thing to do there. Now, if the BBC actually knew what he was doing and part of his illegal activities, then obviously they should fire him for knowing it. But since they didn't, and if they did know about it, they should actually go to court for helping cover it up. You know, that's kind of the two sides of this. Either they knew about it and kept him on board and therefore they were covering the whole thing up and should go to court over it, or they didn't know about it and so presumed innocence, and therefore they shouldn't ask for the salary back. But we live in a world where everyone wants to effectively have rule by social media opinion. Oh, you're going to court, therefore you shouldn't have a job. No, that's ridiculous. And then starting to use words like credibly alleged. The whole implication is that you're trying to get on the, lower end of the wedge to say, I want guilt by just accusation, which is a really dangerous road to go down.
And his fellow MPs begin resigning from Johnson's government en masse.
Yeah, again, the main reason for this is all over some cake and being fined for it. People didn't really care about the fact that he was hiring MPs while they were on trial, because you don't fire people just because they go to court. But I want you to bear that in mind. The whole reason that the Tory party wanted Johnson out was because of the cake thing, was because of breaking COVID rules. I want you to bear that in mind.
On the 8th of July 2022, the man who just recently had been eyeing up a decade in power is forced to make that now iconic, shameful walk out the front door of 10 Downing Street to announce his resignation.
Yep, all because they were -4 in the polls. They were 4 behind Labour. Want you to bear that in mind. 4 behind Labour in the polls, COVID was the issue. That was the whole reason that Boris Johnson was kicked out by the Tories. Just remember it.
It had once seemed almost certain that whenever Boris Johnson did retire, he'd be succeeded by Rishi Sunak, regardless of the disaster of he out to help out.
Disaster in what way? It wasn't a disaster. People just thought it was stupid. It's not a disaster. And yeah, of course he was the continuity candidate. He was supporting Johnson through absolutely everything as Chancellor. Because that's what Sunak's really good at, being in the supporting role, doing what the Prime Minister or anyone else actually wants him to do. That's why they chose him to be in the cabinet. That's why Dominic Cummings even likes him, because he's really good as a Chancellor, but he's not a good leader.
Sunak had gone to great lengths to use COVID to further his personal brand.
Yeah, and this was a bit of a problem that Rishi Sunak had. It was pointed out in an interview on the Winston Marshall show by Douglas Carswell, who was a UKIP MP for Clacton. He pointed out that actually Rishi Sunak has never actually had to win anything in his life, really. Especially now, we've not quite got to the point yet, but I'll go through the whole story. So he ends up with a safe seat in Richmond, which he just keeps winning, obviously, because it's a safe seat. He ends up with 3 positions on the cabinet without really having to fight for anyone, because basically no one had really a good reason to be in number 11 as the Chancellor. Only Rishi Sunak did, because obviously he'd worked in finance. Then when it came obviously to what we're going to get into now, Liz Truss versus Rishi Sunak, he gets absolutely ruined. Like, Liz Truss is the clear winner of that. And then after obviously Liz Truss goes, spoiler alert, he's just installed. There's no election whatsoever. So out of everything, the one time he actually has a challenging election, he just loses it. He loses it outright. And obviously he stays in Richmond because Richmond's one of the safest seats in the country. And so this is why he's had a bit of a disaster as PM, and why he had a complete disaster at the election. Because it's probably the first challenging election he's actually had, apart from maybe the Liz Truss one. And yeah, he just got absolutely rolled, because he had no experience whatsoever.
But remember all those MPs that Boris Johnson had expelled from the Conservative Party during the Brexit debates? Well, those expulsions, along with the broader polarisation of the Brexit process, had led many of the party's more socially liberal members to jump ship.
Yeah, the Tory has a massive problem in that, because it's such a broad church, you have about 10 different factions. And this is the problem. The core membership is very much on the side of social conservatism and, well, effectively Thatcherite economics. And this whole time they've just been led by people who were, well, not that. As much as they put forward the rhetoric of, stop the boats and, yeah, I'm the heir to Thatcher and what have you, they never do anything even close to that. Again, I said it in part 1, highest tax burden since the war, almost half our GDP is on public spending, over a third of that is directly to redistribution of wealth. We're not that far from socialism, really, and that's all been done under 14 years of Tory rule. So yeah, the membership are getting pretty fed up at this point. And actually, the membership are quite glad that people like Anna Soubry jumped ship and that Rory Stewart's out the party now, because they were just Lib Dems pretending to be Tories so that they could get a free seat.
The result being that the party is now comprised almost solely of hardline right-wingers and libertarians.
I mean, that's just complete nonsense as well. Again, I know this was done before the election, but just look at the candidates for Tory leadership now. You know, really, are we saying that Tom Tugendhat is a right-wing libertarian? Are we saying James Cleverly is a right-wing libertarian? You know, even the people who seem to be the favourites with the membership, Kerry Badenoch, she keeps going on about white men. She has pretty good rhetoric, sure, but even I'm at the point where, you know, 2 years ago I wanted her for leader. At this point, I just don't care anymore. I've left the party because I just don't trust any of them. You've even got Priti Patel saying, oh no, there's no such thing as two-tier policing, when it's right in front of us. The only person at this point in that leadership contest that I even remotely trust is Robert Jenrick. And even he, before he became immigration minister, was totally fine with opening the borders. He then went into the immigration department, saw that it was a complete mess, and realised, oh my god, we need to stop this. In terms of MPs, the right-wing libertarians are still a minority. They're a large minority, but they're still a minority. Just ridiculous to try and claim that most of the MPs are right-wing libertarians. Hell, even Jacob Rees-Mogg you have to question, because he won't even defend, due to personal reasons, Enoch Powell's speech, which still quite a few right-wing libertarian MPs will do, because they understood what he was saying.
Sunak does throw his hat in the ring then, but the contest is eventually won by this woman, Liz Truss.
Taken from us far too soon.
Now, as we've already seen, the Conservative Party has always been a party of low taxes and cuts to government spending.
No, we didn't see that. No, we went through part one. No, that's not true at all. Spending went up year on year. Taxes went up year on year. Tax burden's the highest it's been since the war. You're talking complete nonsense. But anyway, that's all covered in part one. I won't dwell on it. But I just get really annoyed when anyone tries to claim that. We never had austerity. Full stop.
But Liz Truss is something else.
Yeah, she's actually pro-free market, and she is actually socially conservative, amazingly.
A one-time contributor to a book called Britannia Unchained, Truss is an unabashed, unreformed libertarian who doesn't so much believe in a small state as no state.
Oh, she was taken from us too soon. Don't make me miss her even more.
Unless, of course, it's serving the needs of the super-rich.
I don't know why he's saying that while leaving this sentence highlighted. There's nothing there that implies that only the super-rich would benefit from a libertarian state. I mean, for God's sake, most of our supermarkets in the UK came about during the Victorian era, the late Victorian era, where we effectively did have... We didn't quite have no state, obviously, but it was about as close to minarchism or small state as we've ever had, as the world's ever seen, really. And loads of these supermarkets are still successful today, because one of the most free market parts of our economy is the supermarket chains. And as much as people like to pretend otherwise, food is still pretty cheap, to the point where even now, where apparently Britain's poor, still one of our biggest issues is obesity, because food is so cheap. And as much as people try and say, oh, well, that's only because of unhealthy stuff, it's not true. I have been living long enough buying my own food to know that the issue with healthy food isn't money, it's just time. People can't be bothered putting a salad together themselves, so you get one pre-made. Yeah, it's like £5. You buy the lettuce, though, the lettuce is less than £1. And then boom, you've basically got your salad.
In fact, Truss turns out to be so extreme in her low-tax fundamentalism.
Her low-tax fundamentalism, where all they planned to do was bring taxes to pre-COVID-19 levels. That was the plan, by the way. That was the plan for Liz Truss. Bring taxes back to 2019 levels, when they were already the highest that the Tories had had since they got back into power.
That she almost bankrupts the entire country in just a matter of weeks.
Well, again, to be fair to Tom here, a lot of the information I'm about to spill out to you didn't actually come out when he made the video, but still, even at the time, there were things that you could have cited to say, well, that was nonsense, wasn't it? But let's hear his details.
On the 23rd of September 2022, Truss unveils a package of economic policies which revolve around £45 billion worth of tax cuts to the country's richest.
Even this bit just isn't true. National insurance increased reversal was the most quote-unquote expensive part of it. costing an estimated £77 billion over 5 years, which, by the way, Tom, because you don't understand economics, I know you don't understand where the 45 billion figure came from, but don't worry, I'll get into that too if it's still relevant in 5 minutes. Anyway, I want to make this point absolutely clear. As you can see from the key at the bottom, those with a cross are those that were rescinded, the policies that were rescinded, I mean, and those with a cross with 2 lines in it were rescinded as well, but by the next Chancellor rather than straight away. As you can see, the top 5 most expensive parts of this budget were mostly implemented. The only thing that wasn't implemented was corporation tax, which, by the way, it's moronic to increase corporation tax going into a recession, which is exactly what we did. Even Labour knew not to do that, so that was probably the most egregious one to actually reverse. But either way, the most expensive parts of this budget were enacted and are still enacted. We still have national insurance increase reversal. We never got that national insurance increase. In fact, Rishi Sunak went further and cut national insurance. We got the energy bill support from 2022 to 2023. We got that. The cost of living support announcement in May 2022. We still get that support. Stamp duty reduction, still in place. This mini budget was so disastrous we basically kept most of it. It is complete nonsense to try and say that this mini-budget was a disaster. It was mostly kept in place. And the things that were mostly kept in place were things that were not necessarily going to boost the economy. National insurance increase reversal. That will have helped because people have more money to spend in the economy. That bit's fine. Corporation tax cancelling? That will have massively helped the economy. Everybody, it is economic doctrine that lowering corporation tax increases business profits and allows them to reinvest their money into their own business to help it grow. You then just get to the subsidies of the energy bill support. It doesn't help the economy grow at all. It just subsidises energy companies that are already corporations that lobby the government to keep small and medium businesses out, to the point where they love the windfall tax because it makes sure that only Shell and BP are operating in the UK. Cost of living support announcement. Again, just a subsidy for people. It doesn't help the economy in any way. All it will do is cause long-term inflation. Stamp duty, the reduction in that will help people buy houses and reduce the cost of housing. That is a good thing that will help the economy as well. But then everything else, I-35 easing, absolutely everyone hates that. Everyone hates it, and they got rid of it because it gets them a tiny bit of tax. Income tax wasn't reduced. Why not do that? VAT-free shopping for foreigners helps the tourism industry, actually brings in more money because it allows shops to actually sell VAT-free, which means they can claim it back. These things will have basically cost nothing, effectively nothing, a few billion over 5 years, that is peanuts. But they will have massively helped the economy, and this means Liz Truss was right to say that we have an anti-growth coalition. Again, I can't point at this graph enough and say the mini-budget was basically implemented. It may as well be. You get rid of the energy bill support, which is the bit I don't think we should ever have had, and you can use, and if anything, that saves money because you can just pay for the rest of the losses, quote unquote, that you'll make from the rest of the mini budget, and then have some money left over. It's just ridiculous to try and say this mini budget was a disaster. It was, for all intents and purposes, poorly implemented. But just going back over this part of the video. Bear in mind, Tom said that, this was just cat taxes. This was just tax cuts for the billionaires. It's just not true. You can tell just from these policies alone, that's not true. Some of the most expensive parts are direct subsidies to people to help heat their homes. Unfortunately, included millionaires. That was the main issue with that. It should have been means tested, at the very least, when it came to energy bill support. But unfortunately, this mini-budget was rushed, because Liz Truss knew that she had, 2 years to make sure that results from this came through, so that she could make the case that, look, we're heading in the right direction now. But no, she was kicked out instead because idiots don't understand economics like Tom. Unfortunately, people have similar understanding to economics as Tom when it comes to Tory MPs, Labour MPs. Doesn't matter. People just don't understand this subject, because understanding this subject is kryptonite to politicians.
And remember, this is a country which has already suffered more than a decade of austerity, and in which every public service, from the NHS to the police, is at crisis point.
The NHS has always been in crisis, and once again, year on year, was getting more money through the Tories. But yeah, it's quite funny, isn't it? You know, I know Tom's whole narrative is just wrong, that, oh, don't you know, the Tories were already cutting taxes and she wanted to do that more. Therefore, it's got to make things worse. No, the opposite was happening. Taxes were going up, spending was going up. Liz Truss actually increased spending with this mini-budget, by the way. And yeah, the tax cuts were the main thing. But because you don't understand that it's actually quite difficult for a government to actually create wealth created mainly through the private sector, then yeah, you won't understand that actually cutting corporation tax in like 5 years could actually see corporation tax receipts increase massively. Like, one example of that, you go to any high street in Britain that's not in a central city, it's nothing but shutters. And if it's not shutters, it's Turkish barbers, pubs, and of course bookmakers. And they're pretty much the only three things that can survive on a high street. Can you imagine a high street with plenty of diverse opportunities to actually shop for different things? I don't know, like specialist crockery suppliers, specialist florists, just the specialist butchers. Butchers are going out of business like nobody's business. These things that you would typically see on a high street 30 years ago, they're all gone. And there's two main reasons for that. High rent, tax. Literally, they're taxed out of being profitable. That is one thing they keep bringing up. Liz Truss was listening to those people. That's why she was so popular with the Tories, you know, because their membership is full of people who run businesses.
So she decides to fund these tax cuts through increased government borrowing.
Oh man, can't think of another time we needed to do a massive amount of borrowing that... Again, the whole start of this was COVID and the pandemic, and he was having to go at Johnson for not keeping lockdown in as long as he could. Do you know what locking down for longer would have meant? Way more borrowing. You were perfectly fine with that 5 minutes ago. But even then, I'll get on to what the actual issue was at the time, assuming that Tom brings up the main issue, which wasn't borrowing. The borrowing had to be done for you know, that was a symptom of another cause. Are you going to mention that, Tom?
Global financial markets usually quite like tax cuts, but Truss's approach is viewed as so bold as to be reckless.
Okay, so it's good that he's bringing up financial markets. Go on. Keep going. There's a little bit more to this story.
Investors quickly come to view holding investments in the UK as far too risky and start selling off government bonds and currency.
Investors don't sell off government bonds. That's not how that works. The way a bond works is that you will have a, 5 to 30 year period where you will effectively buy one of these gilts, they're called in the UK, but government bonds for a set amount of money, and then you get regular interest payments on that for the 5 to 30 year period, depending how long, and then you end up getting that money back at the end of it. Now, this rate is set when you buy the bond, and once you have it for that fixed period. You can't then say, actually, I don't want this anymore. You keep it for that contracted length of time. Also, the idea of selling off currency, what the hell does that mean? At this point, it's just clear that Tom doesn't particularly know what he's talking about. So what actually happened is the Bank of England essentially started a fire sale of government bonds. And it's important we actually understand the reason for that. And this is going to get quite boring, but I'm going to try and give you the answer on a postcard. And this affected something known as lash risk, or liquidity after solvency hedging, which is something the Bank of England started dubbing as a concept over a year after the mini-budget to effectively try and work out why there was such hubbub in the financial markets around the time of the mini-budget. Long story short, pension schemes and other financial companies were investing in what is known as liability-driven investments, which are essentially risky investments that these pension and financial funds used to try and drum up enough cash to pay for their current liabilities and all future ones. But as mentioned, they're quite risky, and they are quite sensitive to the bond market because that's how an awful lot of the investments are made, through investments that rely on the bond market. Here is a graph from the Bank of England report showing the lash risk compared with the gilt yields. As you can see, the risk is inversely proportional to the gilt yield. The lower the gilt yield, the more risky the liability. And so the Bank of England investigated this and found that actually, due to this increase in risk, institutions with larger lash exposure, like the Bank of England, sold substantially higher quantities of gilts during the LDI crisis, i.e. when the mini-budget was happening, and one standard deviation increase in pre-crisis lash risk is associated with 15% higher daily sell volumes during the crisis. In other words, these institutions, such as the Bank of England, exacerbated the problem. If none of this is making sense to you, that's fine. It's very, very difficult to actually understand. But essentially, new government comes in, says we're going for growth, we're going for different economic orthodoxy than you're used to. Interest rates increase because of that, because we're going to pre-post-Keynesian time when interest rates were at 5%. Bank of England panics, starts a fire sale of gilts, substantially more than they probably should have, according to this report, which exacerbated the LDI crisis, meaning that, yes, interest rates increased, bond yields went up, the pound went down because basically no one knew what was going on, and Liz Truss got the blame for it because, according to everyone, it was her fault, because as far as anyone cared, she was the only thing that was new here. But that wasn't what was new here. What was new here as well was the Bank of England's reaction to fire sell something like £60 billion worth of gilts. And still, if none of that still makes sense, that's fine. All you need to know is this paragraph. The effect is statistically and economically highly significant in Table 5, which I will show on screen as well, I might as well. In the most conservative specifications with maturity bucket day and type gild day fixed effects, column 4, a 1 standard deviation increase in Lashit is associated with a 4.1 BPS daily increase in gilt yield. In other words, the LDI crisis was caused by this whole lash concept that the Bank of England exacerbated. Over the entire 16-day crisis period, this would attribute around 66 BPS of the yield spike to lash-induced trading. For comparison, 30-year gilt spiked by 103 BPS over the same period, and therefore, lash-induced trading accounts for around 2/3 of yield spike during the LDI crisis, which was the core of the issue. To put that another way, that is the Bank of England investigating itself and finding that because it didn't regulate LDIs properly, and because it did a fire sale of gilts, 2/3 of the reason that the LDI crisis happened, which is blamed on entirely on Liz Truss's mini-budget, is actually 2/3 their fault. Meaning that at the very most, Liz Truss's mini-budget was 1/3 of the reason for this economic damage. And again, that's not to say that the entire other third was Liz Truss's fault, but, you know, a lot of it will be, fine. But so then to make this video saying, yeah, this was all Liz Truss's fault is just false. To be fair to Tom, he made it before this report came out, but I don't think he would have even touched this if it came out now, so I'm not giving him the benefit of the doubt at all. The man is quite clearly happy to put awful graphs and just say that, oh, you know, the COVID PPE crisis cost billions when it says on screen millions. Like, the man is happy to lie directly against visuals he's put up on screen. There's no way he'd go through a report like this. There is no way that he wouldn't put the blame on anyone other than Liz Truss, despite the fact that it's the Bank of England's fault. Massively the Bank of England's fault, I might add. Anyway, that's about as deep into economic analysis as we're going to go into this episode, because Tom doesn't say anything about economics. So let's get back to normalcy.
The value of the pound plummets, and more importantly for the Conservative Party, interest rates on mortgages begin to rise.
Pound plummeted and recovered in like a week. And once again, as I went through, not even Liz Truss's fault. 2/3 Bank of England's fault, so we're just ignoring that anyway. But also, Tom's just not going to mention that interest rates spiked everywhere at the end of 2022. This was a worldwide event. Why would Liz Truss do this? The real reason is that everyone got hit by the quantitative easing that everyone was doing to fund lockdowns. And not only that, in fact, but obviously the war in Ukraine and Russia caused quite an issue worldwide as well, given that, you know, a lot of Europe relies on Russia for its energy, and quite a lot of, especially sunflower oil and other food, comes from Ukraine as well, and all of a sudden those supply lines are hit because, you know, there's a war going on. So yeah, it's ridiculous to blame this on Truss, but hell, this video is I hate Tories, you should too. So facts don't matter.
The result is that any support for Truss among MPs, party members and voters falls through the floor.
Tory members were pretty happy with the budget, by the way. I still remember going to a couple of Tory meetups and pretty much everyone was happy with it. Even people that were quite sceptical on Truss, they didn't think it was too bad. It's literally just the media bubble that feed this entire concept that it was Liz Truss's fault and everyone hates Truss. The answer isn't true, especially on, you know, within the Tory party and especially with people in Reform. People liked Truss. In fact, that's why people moved to Reform in the initial wave, because why would anyone trust the Tories after they're happy to stab Truss in the back like this?
Just 49 days after she first entered, Truss walked back out of 10 Downing Street and, you guessed it, resigns.
Well, of course she did. She got bullied out of there, effectively. She had an idea to move away from economic orthodoxy, which, the start of this video was saying economic orthodoxy bad. Liz Truss wanted to get away from that, and now you're saying, oh no, not like that. We want actually more economic orthodoxy, you idiot. Great. Again, this whole video, I hate Tories, you should too. It's not informative at all, but people think that this, for some reason, is a great retrospective of the economics of the past 14 years. This is woeful. This is awful. This has absolutely no interest in getting to the bottom of the facts. This only has an interest in pushing media narratives back into your face just to do it through YouTube. This is so bad it's embarrassing.
In doing so, she becomes the shortest serving Prime Minister in UK history.
Yeah, people like to pull that out, but once again, as far as I care, this is a complete betrayal by the Tory party, the media, the Bank of England themselves, who, again, looked into themselves, found that actually, yeah, this actually wasn't Liz Truss's fault, but they're happy to keep that right in the background of their archives to say, yeah, we did the economic analysis, actually, but they're happy to leave it completely unpublicised so that they can't get blamed and have people think, wow, maybe, just maybe, the Bank of England's independence has been a disaster. But no, nobody's going to think that because of people like you, Tom, who have absolutely, who should have interest in actually criticising these media narratives, but have no interest in doing it. We just want to bleat it like a good sheep.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, Truss's chaotic leadership sees the Conservatives' polling numbers drop to new lows.
Yeah, well, to be fair as well, I put blame on Truss for effectively not having this narrative nailed down before actually putting it out there. People like me understood what she was going for because people like me understand free market economics, but most people are just brainwashed into not understanding any of it. Most people genuinely think that the only way to make money is to take it from the super rich and just give it to the poor because they think that the rich just stole it, when in reality, businesses all over the UK are the ones that are making the money. And the government's actually restricting them from doing that properly.
Labour had first taken the lead during Partygate, but the gap has now widened to the point that the Conservatives are a full 30 points behind.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised. You've got people with absolutely no interest in what's going on at all, an entire MP class that are effectively leftist, that includes many Tory MPs. You get someone nominally right-wing getting into Downing Street, wanting to say, tell you what, let's take the tax burden back to 2019 levels, COVID's over, and then everyone says, wow, she's the most right-wing person ever. God, I still remember that Financial Times graph. This one, where apparently, going back to effectively Boris Johnson's initial economic policy, moves them way to the right of the US Republicans, of all things. Yes, the US Republicans, those people that represent Southern America, which is having an absolute boom at the moment. Oh, how terrible. I wouldn't like to be right-wing of that. And I mean, the most laughable part of it is that it's trying to claim that economically the US Democrats and Labour are on level. Even that's not true. A lot of people say that, when it comes to politics in the UK and the US have a right-wing party and a further right-wing party. That's obvious nonsense. But when it does come to the economy, Conservatives are probably on the same level as the Democrats, and the Republicans slightly to the right of that. So you can tell this is just complete nonsense when it's saying, Labour and the Dems, yeah, they're exactly the same economically. It's not true. It's not true at all.
For once then, the party decides that the country doesn't need another election. MPs line up to support Rishi Sunak in taking over the top job, and on the 25th of October 2022, he becomes Prime Minister of the UK.
And as pointed out earlier, keeps some of the most expensive parts of the mini-budget to the point where we may as well say it was implemented, yes. Yes, I do agree.
Sunak tries time and again to rekindle the UK's love affair with the Conservatives. At the beginning of 2023, he makes 5 promises to the British people, mostly based on getting the economy moving again. Nevertheless, progress on these is patchy.
I know I go on about it, but I really do need to labour the point here. This is how little Tom actually understands about economics. There is an open goal here to anyone who even half understands how the economy works. Half inflation. The government has absolutely no power over inflation. It is entirely to do with the monetary policy. which, because the Bank of England is independent and because the Bank of England has complete control over monetary policy, it's entirely on the Bank of England to halve inflation. And in fact, say what you will, that did actually happen, even by this point of making this video by Tom. Inflation had actually more than halved. Grow the economy. Every single measure of the economy actually did grow under Sunak. Say what you want about him, but he did actually manage to at least get those two delivered. Bear in mind, in the first one, yeah, he didn't have any control over it, but you'd know that, Tom, if you actually did research into this video. But you didn't, because all you want to do is bleat what you've read in the BBC and Guardian, which is what's the point? Why not just make a list of things of here's the reason you should hate the Tories, and it's a load of Guardian headlines? Because that's all you're doing here.
The only target which actually gets met is his promise to bring down inflation.
No, as pathetic as the growth is, he also grew the economy. It is quite clear that between his time as starting out, obviously from the end of 2022 to the end of this graph here, which happens to show us just before the election, there is clear growth. It's very small, as I say, it's very, very small, but he did grow it. Nobody should expect massive 10% GDP growth from any Prime Minister, even if he's only been in the job a year and a bit.
But that's more to do with falling energy prices than anything he's done himself.
Oh my god, he screwed it up. He completely screwed it up. Why it's not him. As I said before, it's all to do with the Bank of England, it's all to do with the money supply, it's all to do with monetary policy. It's got nothing to do with energy prices. Price inflation is completely different to money supply inflation or general inflation. He screwed it up. He doesn't understand anything. This is more to do with energy prices going down. Yeah, that only affects energy price inflation. That doesn't affect general inflation, you moron. Do you seriously think we got to 11% inflation just because energy prices went up? Are you mad?
After some initial movement in the right direction, then, support for Sunak and the Conservatives continues to slide.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's always going to happen after you've had 14 years of one party, to be fair.
And the more that Sunak's attempts to win back voters from the Labour Party are met with failure, the more he decides simply to double down on trying to hold on to the small rump of voters that his party has retained.
Well, yeah, but to be honest with you, I don't think most people stopped voting Tories because of their economic policy. I don't think most people cared. Most people are used to the managed stagnation. When it comes to why people left the Tories, it's because they kept promising to deal with immigration and then never did. Again, we have unprecedented levels of immigration, and people saw that the Tories just weren't dealing with it, and, they lost something like, I think it was 40% of their voters went to Reform, and then the rest didn't vote. And I'm going to be honest with you, I think most didn't vote because they were old people who died in the last 4 years.
This involves leaning into the very worst right-wing obsessions. Sunak and his allies begin devising increasingly cruel punishments for asylum seekers and blocking access to healthcare for trans people.
I mean, again, this is just nothing to do with economics anymore. Why are we poor? Oh, because illegal migrants are put on the Bibby Stockholm, which has been used to house homeless people and oil rig workers in other countries. The Bibby Stockholm was effectively a rather nice Premier Inn. There are people I knew in the army who saw the pictures and thought, wow, this is what people are complaining about. I had it way worse with my accommodation even in barracks in Britain. And my God, refusing healthcare access to trans people? No, only trans kids. Because, CAS report.
Sunak tries to hold on for as long as he can, hoping for some kind of miracle.
Again, this is before the election, but in hindsight, people are always saying, why the hell did he do this? And now that we have more facts, we actually know that it's basically because, well, this would probably be his best chance to not completely destroy the party. The speculation goes, he knew that the flights to Rwanda were not going to take off. He knew at that point that it was just impossible to get them out by July or June or whenever he said he was going to get them out. Reform were having a massive surge, even before the election. There were whispers that Nigel Farage was going to return to politics, professionalise the party, and have a proper plan for the election when people were expecting it, which was further down the line, later than now even. And also another bit of speculation is basically there's clear signs that the country is going out of control. The social fabric is quite clearly breaking down, and obviously has been exacerbated quite recently, and people are thinking maybe Sunak had some winds that this was probably not going to be helped, especially with high immigration, high illegal migration as well. I didn't want to be in charge of the party, in charge at the time where social cohesion breaks down in Britain. That last one I don't really buy. The other two, though, I completely buy. It seemed that it was less of a we want to win the election and more of a my God, we need to survive, and we're not going to survive if I wait any longer. I mean, this was such a snap decision that half the cabinet didn't even know it was happening, and this is why a load of people were really annoyed in the Tory party, and hell, as I say, I left it recently, because everyone just feels betrayed.
But at this point, it's just too late. After 14 years in power, more than £100 billion in cuts to public services.
No, not true. Once again, watch the first video. Public spending went up year on year in real terms.
One Brexit referendum, countless corrupt COVID PPE deals.
Countless? There were like 4. That's not countless, that's 4. And again, they weren't even big. I think they summed up to about £500 million. Like, again, in government spending terms, not that much for a waste of money. And again, the issue was of the corruption, not even necessarily the fact that not all the PPE worked, because I'm not going to lie, if you get a whole bunch of PPE emergency rushed into the country, even if this was not done corruptly, you'd still have problems with the PPE. It's just the nature of rushing these things.
And a self-inflicted economic crisis.
So self-inflicted that even now that we have Labour, they have still kept most of the mini-budget implementations that were the most expensive parts, so yeah, good one.
The consequences of Conservative governance are plain for all to see.
I'll stop using food banks as an example. Food banks are a perfectly fine way to have British charity be thrown out across the UK. They are used by people to stop a very short-term stopgap. We can't afford food while I am waiting for this job, while I am waiting for other benefits. Therefore, you can use them. You know, nobody's dying of malnutrition. Part of the reason because of food banks.
A country which has been asset stripped by austerity.
I'm sorry, but your example of assets have been stripped include welfare reforms, which have nothing to do with assets. Some sixth forms closing due to budget cuts. You know, finally, okay, that's a good example maybe. But universities be an example of asset stripping. Are you crazy? Universities have effectively been absolutely ramped up on a Ponzi scheme for the last 14 years. We're at a point where it's reached critical mass. Everyone knows it's basically pointless getting a degree, and now most people are just going to uni through clearing. Partially because it's cheaper, partially because they get better benefits from it, because these unis are happy to give out money to people for going through clearing. And basically, the university Ponzi scheme has reached critical mass. The main reason that the uni Ponzi scheme kept going, by the way, was to keep the housing market going. Because obviously you get hundreds of millions of people going to uni every year. You basically have a renter's market there. Of millions of people looking for short-term accommodation. My God, if you have accommodation to rent, you make millions. That's why so many people are rich, because they're in the housing business. You develop student accommodation, you're guaranteed to be a billionaire. It's crazy.
Cut off from its closest trading partners, and in which spiking inflation and interest rates have sent rents, mortgages, bills, and pretty much everything else through the roof, at the same time as real terms wages have fallen.
Basically everything explained there is a worldwide issue, but this is the reason why you should hate this video, and why it's absolutely pointless to even try and gain any type of knowledge from it. This is the real terms wages graph that he uses. Why do you only put it up to 2012? Why are you only showing it to 2012, Tom? You made this in 2024. Why is the cut-off point 12 years ago, Tom? Why have you done that? Oh, because it turns out that my thesis from the start was correct. No, we are actually just as rich as we were in 2008. We have only just recovered. We've stagnated. That was my whole point from the beginning. Why does it stop at 2012? Because you get to 2014, 2015, real wages start to pick up again. Now, I'm not saying that this is good. I'm not saying that this is a massive success, but my God, it's better to be in a 2008 position than carry on the decline, isn't it? This video has been of absolutely no use to anyone whatsoever, but all the comments are saying, oh, Tom's right, this is great, this is good stuff. No, this is terrible work. This is awful. This is just having stuff that you've heard from The Guardian for over 10 years bleated back at you. Everything's the Tories' fault. The Tories hate you. The Tories only care about their rich mates. It's all basically nonsense. Tories are incompetent. But thank God they managed to keep things stagnant, at the very least.
On the 22nd of May 2024 then, Sunak finally gives up. He steps outside 10 Downing Street, walks up to his podium and stares down the lens of that press ball camera.
That's not giving up. You know, he knew an election was coming. Everyone knew an election was coming. Election had to be called by at least the start of 2025, I believe. He just called it early because, as I say, of all the speculation happening before, he probably knew it was his best chance to not have the Tories wiped out for good. Sometimes the best response to a bad decision is another bad decision. He only had bad decisions to make. But again, you have absolutely no critical view on this. You're just like, oh, Sunak gave up. No, I wouldn't necessarily say that he did, but I certainly think he was expecting to do better than we've seen here. Tories were practically decimated, 100 and odd seats. It's about what people were expecting, and people were pretty pessimistic about the Tories. And so it's no wonder that after the election he's now said, yes, I'm resigning, because he has other better options over in, say, California. There's also been people talking, saying that he's actually already enrolled his kids in schools over in California. Rishi Sunak will be fine. But there's some massive problem we've had. We keep voting people in who keep having other interests abroad. And now we've got Starmer, who said he preferred Davos to Westminster. Do you really want someone like that in charge? According to the British people, yeah, kind of. He gets the highest landslide in British history with one of the lowest turnouts of British history. It's not a good look.
This is not a resignation, but it certainly feels like one.
I don't know if I agree with that. Throughout the entirety of the election campaign, Sunak did look like he was putting effort into at least damage control. So I don't know if I agree with that, but I'll throw him something. Yes, he did look depressing when he was out giving the announcement in the rain.
It's hard to stress how impressive the complete and total implosion of the Conservative Party is.
Yeah, but you don't even really understand why it happened, because you don't understand what Conservative voters actually wanted. The implication was that, being mean to illegal immigrants and being mean to trans people, that's what cost the Tory the election. That was actually the implication here, along with, obviously, all the nonsense about the economy. In reality, Tory voters did want Liz Truss. In reality, Tory voters are on board with being harsher to illegal immigrants and actually sending them to Rwanda or just sending them away. It doesn't really matter. Tory voters are in favour of... Most of them would probably be fine with getting rid of trans healthcare altogether, but most of them certainly don't want kids being treated like they were in the Tavistock Centre. The problem is that no one trusted the Tories to implement any of this anymore, and so mostly moved to reform or died. Or really did think that Labour were going to be as bad as Rishi Sunak said, and to be honest with you, from what I've seen so far, they're probably actually worse.
The UK sometimes gets described as having a two-party political system.
What the hell do you mean sometimes? It's always been a two-party system. What are you talking about? I've been reading Gladstone and Disraeli recently. They even referred to the two-party system then, between the Whigs and the Tories. There's always been a two-party system. It's what first past the post incentivises. So of course you're going to get a two-party system. What do you mean sometimes? It's all the time.
In practice, it basically has a one-party system.
Oh, are you going to start talking about the uniparty and how the difference between Labour and Tories is actually relatively small? And that, in fact, what the Tories have been doing since basically World War II, apart from a bit of a hiccup with Thatcher, is doing what Labour want but slower? Are you going to explain that?
Of the past 100 years, the Conservative Party has been in power for more than 70 of them.
No, apparently not. Apparently his reasoning is going to be because one party is better than the other, therefore it's a one-party state, which is just nonsense. It's not the Tories' fault that you think it's a one-party state just because they're better at getting elected.
At time of recording, it looks pretty certain that same party is going to lose the next election, big time.
Well, yeah, pretty much everyone could tell that. Even people that had paid no attention to politics knew that Labour were going to win a landslide.
But whether the party eventually bounces back from that defeat or not, the experiments they've inflicted on the country have left damage which will last a long, long time.
Again, I suppose something that I really should mention at this point is that while I keep saying it's stagnated, that is because generally London and some other big financial centres of Britain, Manchester say, do tend to get the brunt of the economic upturn while everywhere else just feels poorer. Like, I do completely agree with that. I do understand that. But the thing is that Tom's answer to this is basically, oh, just tax the pants off the people who have got all this money and just give it to these poor people. Like, that will be his answer. And then the problem with that is that effectively you end up just killing the golden goose. You know, top outflows, China, communist, well, mostly communist country. UK, not communist, mostly communist country. India, I have no idea what India's economics is like, but I don't think it's very good, and I think that's why a lot of Indians are trying to leave there. Point being, it ain't good when nearly 10,000 millionaires are leaving in 2024, and we're not even by the end of the year yet. And again, that is mostly because, as you have pointed out, it looks like the Tories are going to get smashed by Labour, who absolutely no one trusts to actually not raise taxes like they said they wouldn't. Hell, for ages they said, oh, we know what the Tories have screwed up on. We have access to the OBR. It's all public interest and public information, all the problems with the economy that they've caused. Then they get in and say, well, there was 22 billion that we completely missed. How did we do that? Because they lie. And so people know that they're lying about not raising taxes. Therefore, millionaires are fleeing the nest. Your golden egg's gone. How do you plan to do better with an economy when most of the rich people who help grow the economy just leave?
Perhaps most worrying is the extent to which some of the basic precepts of those experiments have come to be accepted by Sunak's rivals in the Labour Party.
Yeah, it's almost like it's what the electorate want. The electorate don't want taxes. As much as everyone says, oh yes, I'd love it if millionaires are taxed more, they always mean someone richer than them. Sorry, Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall was on some panel show saying, oh, we need to tax the rich. And so I pointed out in the comments, like, oh, you're worth £3 million. When are you going to offer more of your money that you think should be taxed? And everyone makes the point of, oh, it doesn't mean him, though, does he? You know, there's richer people than him. That's what he's on about. It's like, yeah, I know. You people are idiot hypocrites. Nobody likes paying tax because they don't think they're getting their money's worth. Everyone tries to avoid tax as much as they can. Yes, even working class people. That's why a lot of them work cash in hand, which I'm more than happy to help out with. Because at the end of the day, these businesses need to run. And the thing that's actually getting in the way is ridiculously high amounts of tax. Whether it be corporation, VAT, doesn't matter. People feel taxed up the wazoo. So it's no wonder that then Labour carry on this, oh, don't worry, we won't tax you. Why? Again, austerity wasn't supposed to last forever. We were supposed to be past the point of austerity. Taxes were supposed to be coming down. Tax burn's only ever gone higher. And we're at the highest point since the war. And Labour are only going to make that go up. No, nobody believes Labour won't raise taxes, Tom. Nobody believes that.
On the 4th of July, it looks very likely that it will be Labour leader Keir Starmer walking into 10 Downing Street as the new Prime Minister. Starmer has repeatedly criticised Liz Truss's disastrous reforms and Boris Johnson's lies.
Yeah, he's just like you. That's all he can really do. Criticise without any critical thinking.
Nevertheless, he's completely walked back on his earlier support for a referendum on rejoining the EU, and he remains committed to an economic approach grounded in austerity.
And I'm not going to go through the details of all that, because if you really want to, you can go to the Worcester Club and see us go through the Labour manifesto. It's just nonsense. Again, Tom hasn't read any of this. Even from that little screenshot alone, whereas like equality, we want economic equality, economic justice, social justice. We want to fight climate change. It's all similar stuff to what Corbyn was promising. It's just Corbyn was an absolute madman about it. Keir Starmer understands that the electorate wants someone who reminds them of Thatcher, that we are going to at least keep the economy stable. He understands that that's what you need to tell the electorate. Now, already inflation's going up again under Labour. Obviously, this is after the fact of this video. People seem happy that public sector workers are getting a pay rise, which, to be honest, I don't even think it's unreasonable that they get a pay rise. The problem is that it's quite a large one, larger than anyone in the private sector has seen for quite some years. And then other unions have started striking now because they want a bit of that pie. And this is a spiral that's just going to go out of control, and guess what? How are they going to pay for it? Oh, more taxes. And guess what's going to happen? Someone's going to have to come in and implement austerity again. Great. It's almost like you need to understand what's going on properly, Tom, and stop giving this nonsense misinformation out to your audience.
In the same way that David Cameron once waved that note stating that there was no money left, Keir Starmer has repeatedly used Liz Truss's trashing of the economy.
Are you not going to point out that was a lie? Again, it wasn't the economy trash. The economy actually grew under Liz Truss. The financial markets took a bit of turbulence, subsided in like a week, despite yet again the fact that the mini-budget was mostly implemented. It's just total nonsense.
As a reason to scale back his promises.
Yeah, again, the electorate aren't idiots. If people truly believe, which they do, by the way, which I think is a great shade, that Liz Truss crashed the economy and that therefore we need economically sensible policy, then of course scaling back ambitions is going to be part and parcel of that, for God's sake. You're helping with Keir Starmer excusing his scaling back of what he wants to do, which, to be honest with you, I'm fine with him scaling back what he wants to do because it's ludicrous.
His manifesto retains most of the Conservatives' cuts to welfare, has a much less ambitious approach to tackling climate change than he once promised, and suggests the party will promote further privatisation of the NHS.
Further privatisation of the NHS. Again, I'm pretty sure I mentioned it in part one. Privatisation makes up about less than 1%, I think it is. It's certainly less than 10, I can't remember the exact number. A very small amount of the healthcare industry in Britain. The NHS has a total monopoly on it. Labour aren't changing that by giving out slightly more private contracts. Secondly, the climate change stuff is still the core of the Labour manifesto. They want what? Was it 28 billion for the National Wealth Fund, which you're not going to go into detail on it, but effectively the plan is to put it all into completely or mostly useless industries, with private investment supposedly helping out for things that just aren't going to make a return on profit. Carbon capture storage, how does that make money? The only thing that made sense was the ports, but nobody wants hydrogen power. That's bygone. Nobody uses that. Gigafactories, mostly for electric vehicles, which many have had to be closed down because simply nobody wants to buy them because they're too expensive. You know, this is stuff with industries that are currently on the downturn. And what, you think just putting public money into it's going to change that? No. At the end of the day, you are still at the whims of ultimately what people want. That is how markets work. And if they don't want these things you're trying to push public money into, then yeah, you're going to end up with a recession.
In fact, where you would think an election campaign would mostly revolve around the two main parties criticising each other over their specific plans for government, the current contest has largely consisted of each party criticising the other for daring to want to spend any money.
Well, yeah, both parties rode on the "we don't have money because of Liz Truss" train. Which again, it's not true, it's the Bank of England. But still, fact of the matter is, if that happens, of course it's all going to be, we're not going to spend money we don't have. I'd love to see what Tom Nicholas thinks now that Labour have said further, oh, we actually don't have money and actually have to save 22 billion. Which, by the way, when it came to that white paper, it turned out that most of that was due to Labour policy that they just introduced. So to blame that 22 billion on the Tories is moronic, but Labour lie, who knew?
Which is a problem, because after 14 years of cuts and mismanagement, the UK needs investment, and lots of it.
Yeah, you know what, I'd agree with that. Do you know what's not going to help? 10,000 millionaires leaving the country at the start of the year. That is not going to help. Again, if the public doesn't have any money, if the government doesn't have taxpayer money to invest in these things, where do you expect the money to come from? You know, where are these millionaires going? They're going to the US, they're going to the UAE, they're going to places where they won't be taxed up to the wazoo just for trying to invest their money and spend their money and just live there. It's just ridiculous to think that Labour being more Corbynite is the answer here. But that's Tom Nicholas's outlook on things because he doesn't understand economics.
Last year, one researcher at the Institute for Public Policy suggested that the UK had contracted a debilitating case of investment phobia.
See, Tom hears that and thinks, oh, that's because the government isn't investing taxpayer money enough, when in reality, no. Vast majority of investment for growth comes from the private sector because return on investment, profits, in other words, is a damn good way of making an economy grow, because all a profit means is that someone is willing to pay extra for the efficiency of whatever good or service you are providing. But you get a profit in terms of monetary value, they get a profit in terms of they need whatever you've provided and they can't do it themselves. You know, think food, for example. It takes absolutely ages to grow a tomato. You just go down to the shop and buy one for 30 pence. That will be a razor-thin margin of about, a penny or something like that. Probably even less, actually. But you scale that up to 66 million people. If 66 million people buy a tomato with a 1 penny profit, you've made 66 million profit. Damn, the supermarket industry's taken off. Wonder why? Wow. Because it's the only industry allowed to be a free market in Britain, and even then it's not a proper, fully forced free market, so it could be doing better. But obviously Tom just thinks, all growth needs to come from the government, because he's a socialist. And you can tell he's a socialist because he doesn't know anything about economics.
In which the government refuses to invest in infrastructure.
Boom, absolutely called it out. But I mean, to be fair, this is another issue. Why aren't we investing in infrastructure? Because the NHS is kneecapping us.
Which leads to businesses not wanting to invest either.
I don't think any business has cited, wow, the infrastructure in this area is really bad, that's why my business is failing. I don't think of a single time where a business has failed and they say, that's because the trains aren't running on time. Again, the main reason your high street's empty is because of high rents. It's not because the bus doesn't go through there every half hour instead of every hour.
Combine that with the country having been cut off from its closest trading partners.
We made trade deals post-Brexit, for God's sake. Nothing was cut off. We had a Brexit, we had a deal, we made more trade deals. Our imports and exports have largely been unaffected. Even The Guardian, as I mentioned in the first part, had to say that.
And a crisis of trust in politics, and you end up with a country that feels so much poorer than it once did.
I mean, key point there, once again, he says, feels poorer. Isn't actually poorer, which is the main thing I'd point there. Isn't actually poorer, it just feels poorer. And again, you can completely distrust MPs and politicians and still have a successful country that feels like it's getting richer. Charles Dickens absolutely hated politicians, and even he felt like things were clearly improving throughout Britain, despite his early work that was effectively saying it's a hellhole for kids. By the time he was older, child labour laws had been taken into place. Okay, all it did was actually limit the amount of hours they could work, but even he could see things were improving, and again, he hated politicians.
Fixing that is going to be one hell of a task, and the challenge for Keir Starmer is that if he can't make a very real difference to people's lives pretty quickly, then he might find that his party's popularity is pretty short-lived.
Yeah, again, I mean, I'm talking about this a month after the election. Already, Starmer's losing support, and it was already pretty low. Just today, polls have come out, and effectively what most of them are saying is that Labour are losing support, Reform are gaining support, everyone else is equal. This trend is only going to get worse for Labour, and my God, this is part of the reason I'm joining Reform. Because frankly, especially after the disaster that has been the conflict of communities being shown for what it is throughout the UK, and Starmer clearly picking a side, yeah, it's kind of no wonder that nationalism is making quite a comeback. But anyway, once again, this is going off topic of economics, but who cares? Tom Bailey talks about economics throughout the video.
As many of you will know, the UK election isn't the only election taking place this year.
In November, our American friends will also be Pokemon going to the polls to elect the next president of the United States.
Oh my God, again, so much has happened in a month. Yeah, Joe Biden isn't running anymore, is it? It's Kamala Harris. And that genuinely seems to have put a spanner in the works. I don't think anyone wants to comfortably call who's going to win that election. No doubt he's going to say Trump will have won it, but it doesn't matter. I'm just going to skip all this bit because way too much context has changed there. Quite a lot of his predictions for Labour and all that was still relevant. This just isn't. Oh, in fact, I just went through that bit to see if he says anything else of note. But no, he just does a massive advert for Nebula because he's doing a feature-length documentary on boomers. Which, if it's anything like this, don't pay for Nebula. Don't pay for Nebula. This was awful. I don't trust anything else he'd make. This was truly horrendous. This had so little analytic value, so little extra to actually add to the conversation of why Britain's economy is not doing as well as it should be, that genuinely, I think Tom Nicholas should pay me to teach him economics. He should pay me for just giving him free advice on how to even frame economics. He should pay me for this video. Tom, I want to see in this video, you give me a super thanks of 50 quid to let me know that you have listened through this and understood what I'm saying. And if you haven't, give me 100 to ask me questions and I will happily answer them all. Obviously the chances of that happening are basically nil, so, just to let you all know, that was a joke. Anyway, as I say, he had nothing else to say there apart from to shill Nebula, which, frankly, I think this was all this video was for. I'm not going to make anything for a while, so I'm just going to bleat a load of Guardian headlines at you and then give you an advert for Nebula. Because that's how most leftists actually do this type of thing. They make absolutely god-awful videos just to shill Nebula. Philosophy Tube did it a while ago, and I reacted to that, and it turns out, oh, you did all this just for a Nebula advert. And leftists suck it up. Basically just because these people are charismatic. That's the only reason. They get a degree in politics, in philosophy, in not necessarily economics, it'll be PPE, but they ignore economics. And then, because of that, all that basically does is teaches you to be a good public speaker and gives you some good insight into whichever of the two subjects you chose out of the three. And then you end up like Tom Nicholas here. I wouldn't be shocked if he ended up doing a PhD in PPE, and that gives him this false sense of security that, oh, I'm an expert in politics, philosophy, and economics, therefore I can make this 40-minute nonsense. Well, no, I've gone through it, and it's nonsense, I'm afraid. This was a failure of a video, and you should be embarrassed by it, but I know you're not. So why would you care what a randomer on YouTube has to say? Well, I cared enough to go through yours. Anyway, with that is everything I had for you today. So, Laughing at the Guardian will return on Saturday. Please do come along to that. Tosh will return next week. Again, it will be the newscast. Regional Variations is still TBD. I imagine it will be returning, but when exactly it's returning, I do not know. So, I might plan for my own streams on Wednesdays. It'll probably be gaming, something like that, because I need to finish off Disco Elysium. So yeah, I guess I'll see you there. Other shilling, obviously, subscribe, like, what have you. Become a member if you think that I have earned the money. If not, obviously, super thanks, super chats, one-off payments, they all do as well. But, you know, we like to keep this channel going. A good way to do it is to support in that way. It's certainly the most direct way, and I think I need to be a bit more shameless about trying to say that, because I think I put good work in here. I'm at the point in my channel where I'm pretty happy with everything I'm putting out quite consistently, and so I'm less embarrassed as I used to be to say, you know, you can become a member. Now I'm saying, no, become a member if you think I earned it. It's totally up to you. Anyway, that might just be cope, I don't know. Anyway, that is everything I had for you today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.